December 20th, 1943, 30,000 feet above the frozen clouds over Bremen, the inside of a B-17 bomber roars like a steel storm. The engines shake the fuselage, the air quivers with the hammering of 50 caliber Brownings, and the smell of cordite mixes with sweat and fear. Sergeant Frank Donovan, just 20 years old, clutches the cold handles of his waist gun, eyes locked on a speck racing toward the bomber formation. A German FW-190 lunges out of a sunbeam, slicing across the sky at an impossible angle. Its wings flash in the light, its cannons already spitting orange streaks. Donovan swings his gun, crosshairs chasing the fighter, and fires. Tracer lines leap through the thin blue air and miss everyone. The fighter slashes past, untouched, its engine wailing as it banks for another attack. He'd aimed directly at it. He'd done what instinct told him to do. And like thousands of gunners before him, it hadn't worked. When the debrief came hours later, after smoke, blood, and silence, the instructor whispered what sounded like madness. "Next time, aim behind him." That single counterintuitive command would change the way American gunners fought the air war, and it would double their kills before the war's end. The question was, why aiming the wrong way was suddenly right? The answer begins months earlier, far from the combat zones, inside a quiet gunnery training base in Texas, where the U.S. Air Forces were discovering that bravery alone could not solve the laws of physics. In early 1943, the air war over Europe had turned into a brutal equation no one could seem to solve. Every day, hundreds of American bombers crossed the English Channel bound for Germany, each packed with 10 men, each trusting the rows of 50 caliber guns bolted into their aircraft to hold off enemy fighters. Yet mission after mission, the same pattern emerged. Vicious dogfights, streaking tracers, enemy fighters cutting through formations untouched. The U.S. Army Air Forces called it the defensive crisis. Instructors at gunnery schools knew their men were well trained. They could load, lock, and fire blindfolded. They could identify aircraft silhouettes in half a second. But their hit rates hovered near 4%. 96 out of every 100 bullets fired hit nothing but cold air. At first, commanders blamed nerves. They said the gunners were shooting too soon or flinching from cannon bursts. But film from gun cameras told another story. Steady aim, clean control, perfect technique, yet tracer fire passing harmlessly behind enemy tails. The problem wasn't courage. It wasn't poor eyesight. It was something deeper, something almost invisible. Thousands of miles from combat, at the Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School in Laredo, Texas, instructors ran experiment after experiment. They mounted machine guns on the beds of moving trucks, had recruits fire at towed targets dragged behind jeeps, even projected film strips of enemy fighters flying across screens. Every method produced the same failure. When targets crossed laterally, recruits fired directly at them and missed. Only when targets flew head-on did their accuracy improve. Physics was the invisible enemy. In the split second a bullet left the muzzle, the target had already moved. A Japanese Zero or a German FW-190 flying at 300 miles per hour didn't glide. It sliced through the sky faster than the gunner's brain could process. At 300 mph, an aircraft crossed nearly 440 feet per second. The Browning M2's bullet left the barrel at almost 2,900 feet per second, but at common engagement ranges of 300 yards, the bullet still needed a third of a second to arrive. In that third of a second, the target had shifted 11 car lengths forward. Every gunner was aiming at a ghost, at the spot where the enemy had been, not where it was going. It looked right. It felt right. But the math said otherwise. Deflection shooting, leading the target, was the only answer. Yet explaining that to a 19-year-old under machine gun fire was like asking him to solve trigonometry in the middle of an earthquake. Military scientists already knew the numbers. The Royal Air Force had learned it the hard way in 1940 during the Battle of Britain. But the British faced a simpler problem. Their pilots controlled their own aircraft. In a bomber, the gunner couldn't maneuver. He could only fire from a fixed position, in a vibrating metal cage, while the world tilted around him. Deflection wasn't a matter of skill. It was a psychological war between instinct and physics, and instinct was winning. Commanders at Laredo sent urgent memos up the chain to Air Force headquarters. Trained gunners failing to connect. Need new teaching methods. By mid-1943, the reports had turned desperate. Bombing raids over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen were losing up to 20% of their aircraft in a single day. Veteran gunners knew that if something didn't change soon, the bomber campaign would collapse before it ever reached Berlin. Somewhere in those memos, inside a small office at Wright Field, an analyst would stumble upon a forgotten paper written almost 2 decades earlier, a document that predicted the crisis exactly. It had been sitting in a filing cabinet since 1924, covered in dust, waiting for someone to notice. The paper's author was Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, an American artillery officer and mathematician who served during World War I. In 1924, he had written a document titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery. It warned that as aircraft speeds increased, the angles of deflection required to hit moving targets would soon surpass human intuition. Puckle's calculations were blunt. Beyond 200 miles per hour, a gunner would need to aim several aircraft lengths ahead of a crossing target. So far ahead that it would feel wrong even to try. His predictions were archived, ignored, and forgotten. 2 decades later, the world caught up to his math. By early 1943, airmen were dying from the very misunderstanding Puckle had described. Deflection wasn't just a technical issue, it exposed the limits of human perception. Our brains evolved to track animals moving tens of miles per hour, not fighter planes streaking at hundreds. When danger flashed across the sky, instinct screamed to aim at what was visible, not at empty space. Under stress, no amount of schooling could overcome that reflex. Even experienced marksmen, men who could hit clay pigeons blindfolded, failed to translate those instincts to the sky. Inside the technical division at Wright Field, Captain Robert Williams reviewed gunnery footage and training data. The pattern was identical across both the Pacific and European theaters. He came across Puckle's century-old paper by chance, tucked into an Army library file on ballistic prediction. As he read it, a chill spread through him. Every detail matched what pilots and gunners were reporting. Puckle had solved the problem long before the B-17 existed. The physics had not changed, only the machines had. Williams forwarded the paper to senior command with a note scribbled in the margin. He warned us 20 years ago. Yet understanding the problem wasn't the same as fixing it. Mathematics couldn't teach instinct. Gunnery instructors had already tried lectures, charts, even primitive simulators. Nothing replaced live combat experience, and most gunners didn't live long enough to gain it. Across the Atlantic, the British Royal Air Force had stumbled onto a clue during the Battle of Britain. Squadron leader Horace Darley, a former competitive clay shooter, discovered that training pilots to think about lead distances didn't work, but training them to feel deflection through motion did. Instead of calculating, they fired while still turning toward the target, letting their own movement supply the lead naturally. Accuracy doubled. American instructors studied those British reports and quickly realized that while fighter pilots could generate deflection through maneuver, bomber gunners were trapped in fixed mounts. If instinct and conscious aiming both failed, the solution had to come from somewhere else, either through mechanical aid or an entirely new visual reference system. In the skies over Europe, gunners like Frank Donovan didn't care where the solution came from, only that it worked. The formations were taking heavier losses every week. Between August and October 1943, The 8th Air Force lost more than 1,500 bombers, over 15,000 crewmen missing, wounded, or dead. Men rotated home with haunted eyes and trembling hands. Others never returned. But on a gray morning in July 1943, inside the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, a small team led by Dr. Charles Stark Draper unveiled an invention they believed could finally turn theory into survival. They called it the Mark 14 computing gunsight, a device that promised to think faster than human instinct ever could. It would take months before that invention reached actual bombers, but its principle, teaching the gun to correct for human limitation, would spark one of the most remarkable transformations in air combat history. And far away, on the deck of a carrier in the Pacific, a waist gunner with no college education was about to rediscover the same truth through grit, repetition, and instinct, a discovery that would lead U.S. gunners to double their hit rates by aiming behind what they could see. The first angle was human, the silent confusion of men doing everything right and watching it fail. The reports from debriefings were filled with disbelief. "I saw him in the sight," one gunner wrote. "The tracers were right on him, but nothing hit." Training manuals told these 19-year-olds to keep calm, conserve ammunition, and aim where the target appeared. In the chaos of combat, that logic held, until it didn't. The sky above Fortress Europe became a theater of heartbreak. Inside a B-24's waist compartment, the air pressure dropped near freezing. Gunners fought not just enemies, but their own shaking hands. When fighters came in from the side, they fired, watched their tracers pass cleanly behind, and wondered what more they could give. Their nerves weren't weak. Their instincts simply belonged to an older world. It wasn't courage that failed in those moments. It was math colliding with evolution. The tactical angle followed naturally. In air combat, everything was relative: speed, distance, and timing. The pilots and gunners were bound by geometry as much as by bravery. Firing directly at a fighter crossing at 300 mph was like trying to hit a bird by aiming at its last feather. What mattered was where that fighter would be when the bullet arrived, not where it was when the gunner squeezed the trigger. To stand a chance, they needed to stop thinking in snapshots and start thinking in motion. But understanding motion required something the military had never accounted for: time delay. The half-second it took for a bullet to travel 600 feet made 100 feet of difference in target position. The faster the enemy, the more severe the lead. Instructors knew the numbers, but couldn't translate them into visual intuition. A gunner needed a way to see the delay, to aim where the enemy would arrive, rather than where it was. Then came the technological angle, the place where physics met machinery. Dr. Charles Stark. Draper's Mark 14 gunsight at MIT was an analog computer encased in metal. Using gyroscopes and mirrors, it measured target movement and automatically adjusted the aim point. When a gunner tracked an enemy plane and maintained lock for 2 seconds, the sight calculated velocity, distance, and offset, projecting a glowing dot ahead of the enemy's nose. That was the future, the place the bullet would meet the plane. And suddenly, for the first time, the human eye could see the solution that math had already known. Training films later captured the shift in performance. Hit rates jumped from 4% to nearly 25% once the system reached operational deployment. But mechanical miracles couldn't cover the Pacific fast enough, where battles raged daily and crews flew with outdated mounts. There, a different kind of discovery was about to happen, one born not from computation, but from experience. A 31-mission gunner named William Bill Fleming would find it not in laboratories or equations, but in the rhythm of survival itself. There was also a leadership angle. The commanders and instructors who took the psychological defeat of their gunners personally. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, officers had begun to understand that the human element could not be bullied into perfection. You couldn't lecture a reflex. You could only retrain it. By early 1944, that realization reached carrier decks in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare, a Medal of Honor recipient and ace fighter pilot, saw the same problem among Navy gunners that the Army Air Forces had faced the year before. Highly trained crews, precise machinery, endless missed shots. O'Hare's frustration became the seed for what would become one of the most practical revolutions in aerial gunnery, the spot shooting method. Here, the moral and cognitive angle revealed itself. Instinct told human beings to confront danger head-on, to aim at what threatened them. But war demanded an inversion of instinct. It required men to trust math they couldn't see. O'Hare and gunners like Fleming began shaping training that played to human strengths instead of fighting them. They realized people were excellent at comparing sizes, not distances. So rather than explaining lead in feet, they used the size of the target itself as a ruler. 1 plane length forward for shallow crossing shots, 2 lengths for moderate, 3 or more for steep angles. Simple, memorable, and brutally effective. It wasn't elegant science. It was field logic, born from observation, trial, and pain. Fleming documented it in a notebook filled with sketches of enemy silhouettes, arrows, and markings. He couldn't describe gyroscopic motion, but he could define success in visual terms. When O'Hare reviewed Fleming's logs in March 1944, he understood instantly what he was looking at. Empirical proof of instinct rewritten through repetition. Then came the tactical payoff. Within weeks of introducing the spot shooting drills, the Lexington's Air Group saw hit rates more than double. The equations were the same, but now every gunner had a visual translation of invisible geometry. It was deflection, simplified for survival. And behind all of this lay a deeper moral dimension. It showed that technology, for all its brilliance, was still secondary to adaptation. The courage to accept that what feels right might be wrong, and that wisdom sometimes means trusting tools or training over impulse. Across the Pacific, aboard other carriers like the Essex and Enterprise, officers copied Fleming's method. Diagrams were mimeographed, hand-drawn on boards, passed from squadron to squadron. Each man learned the same counterintuitive truth. To hit what's racing across your sight line, you must aim where nothing is. By the summer of 1944, that truth and the fragile balance between machine calculation and human intuition would converge in one of the most decisive turning points in America's air war. The turning point began with data, cold, undeniable numbers arriving from combat reports in the spring of 1944. An analyst aboard the Lexington compared weeks of engagements before and after Fleming's spot shooting sessions. The difference was staggering. Before the drills, gunners averaged just over 4 hits per 100 rounds. After, the number climbed past 9. In a fight, that was the difference between scaring an attacker away and cutting him from the sky. Navy Command circulated the results immediately. Within 2 months, carrier gunnery officers across the Pacific were handing down simplified orders. Count plane lengths. Fire through the blank. From the Solomon Islands to the Marianas, gunners began retraining on wooden flight decks between missions, walking through mock engagements under the tropical sun. It wasn't teaching so much as rewiring, forcing muscle memory to replace instinct. At the same time, over Europe, the Army Air Forces were introducing the Mark 14 computing gunsight. Where Fleming's method trained the brain to compensate, the Mark 14 trained the machine to do it for them. Gunners learned to center the target, track smoothly, and trust the faint glowing reticle floating ahead of the enemy aircraft. The reticle that showed where the bullets would meet metal, not where the pilot's eyes said they should aim. The first real combat tests came in August 1943 at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk. The results seemed unthinkable. Average hit rates against crossing targets shot up from 5% to 18%. Within a week of practice, experienced crews were registering 25%. Nothing else in the war matched that speed of improvement. What these men achieved wasn't magic. It was physics finally obeyed. Every success confirmed what Puckle and Draper had both known decades apart. The human brain could not compute angular motion at combat speed. Only practice or machinery could close that gap. But while calculations were rewriting aerial combat, the emotional transformation was just as profound. For gunners who had spent months watching tracers vanish into nothing, the first time they saw an enemy aircraft erupt in smoke was almost spiritual. After endless failure, their bullets connected. The invisible geometry turned visible fire. For many of them, it wasn't triumph. It was relief. Yet even with these breakthroughs, another issue emerged: the collapse of instinct under fear. Psychologists embedded with bomber units began to notice a pattern they called threat fixation collapse. Under fire, even trained gunners reverted to instinctive aiming. The moment cannon rounds flashed toward them, they forgot lead distances and aimed at the source of threat. Their survival brain overrode the physics. That discovery led to the next phase of transformation: training that pushed repetition past exhaustion. Gunnery schools extended courses from 4 weeks to 8, then to 10. Ammunition allotments tripled. Students now fired 5,000 rounds over their course, more than the entire early war curriculum combined. It wasn't just about teaching. It was about saturating the subconscious until deflection became reflex. In Jacksonville, Florida, one instructor found a new way to drill the lessons into instinct. He mounted heavy guns on swiveling, motorized turrets beside the docks, and had fast boats drag targets across open water at 60 miles an hour. The sea became their practice sky, the foam their contrails. Every trainee learned through a feedback loop of sight, sound, and strike. The lessons bled into muscle and nerve until the cognitive part vanished completely. Those who survived 30 missions displayed something astonishing in gun camera footage. No hesitation, no overcorrection, no trace of calculation. While fear compressed every second into chaos, their hands held the proper lead automatically. They had reached what psychologists called unconscious competence, what martial artists called mushin, the mindless mastery that separates instinct from panic. It was that mastery that transformed the skies over Europe and the Pacific in 1944, and by the time the Allies launched their summer offensives over France and the Philippines, the new deflection mindset had turned the air war's numbers inside out. By mid-1944, the change was visible not on training ranges, but in the chaos of real battle. It showed in the gun camera reels stored under flickering lights in airbase darkrooms, white flashes of tracers meeting metal, contrails splitting into black smoke. The difference between a miss and a victory had finally narrowed to a science. On June 21, 1944, during the raid on Berlin, 8th Air Force formations reported loss rates under 4%, almost half of what they'd endured the previous winter. Reports credited the new radius of action sighting method, the Army's adaptation of Fleming's visual lead principle. Instructors now spoke a language every gunner understood. 2 wingspans forward for fast crossings, 1 for shallow. What had once been incomprehensible math became simple routine. In the Pacific, the learning was even more immediate. Carrier groups striking the Marianas and the Philippine Sea flew with gunners drilled in the spot shooting method. At first glance, they aimed wrong, always a touch behind, always firing into space. But their bursts met rushing Japanese Zeros with shocking precision. Analysts measured double the previous hit ratios. The battlefield didn't just look different. It sounded different. Gunfire, once frantic, now came in controlled bursts, deliberate, patient. Gunners tracked targets through smoke and glare, trusting invisible vectors they'd memorized through repetition. Whenever a fighter flashed past, the tracers no longer stitched cleanly behind. It flew into a trap already spinning through the air. the transformation rippled upward. Fighter pilots noticed bombers holding formation longer, shrugging off fewer attacks. Commanders realized that formations, once labeled defensively weak, were now capable of driving off waves of interceptors. War correspondents reported seeing German fighters break away from tight American boxes mid-attack, unwilling to face the withering return fire. Technology and training had made men predictable only in one direction, toward deadly accuracy. But progress carried cost. The new methods demanded weeks of ammunition use and endless hours of mental conditioning. Many young airmen burned out under the pressure. To reach automatic mastery meant surviving enough missions to internalize the lessons, and survival itself was never guaranteed. For some, the new techniques came too late, learned just days before their final sortie. Still, statistically, everything shifted. By the autumn of 1944, average gunner effectiveness across the European theater had grown fivefold compared to early 1943. Bomber loss rates dropped below 3% per mission, and enemy kills per engagement soared. The equations finally balanced. The invisible geometry once lost in the chaos of battle was now embedded in every gunner's trigger pull. Historians later called this moment the deflection revolution. It marked a rare instance when science, psychology, and soldier met at perfect intersection. It wasn't about inventing new weapons, but about teaching humanity to overcome its most stubborn reflex, to aim not at what's seen, but at what will be. And as 1945 approached, that mental shift would carry forward into the war's final stage, where the destruction of Germany and Japan wasn't just a story of superior numbers or machines, but of men who had finally learned to trust calculation over instinct. The war would end within a year, but the consequences of that invisible shift, born in laboratories, training ranges, and open skies, would echo through every era of warfare that followed. When the air war finally tilted in favor of the Allies, it didn't happen because the B-17s suddenly grew stronger or the FW-190s grew weaker. It happened because crews had learned to think in the language of physics. Between mid-1944 and early 1945, air combat data told a quiet but profound story. U.S. bomber groups were surviving longer, not by avoiding battle, but by fighting smarter. Official 8th Air Force records show that by July 1944, average loss rates per mission hovered around 3.4%, down from more than 5% the previous year. That statistical drop, seemingly small on paper, represented thousands of lives saved every month. Analysts traced it directly to gunnery. Improved accuracy meant more enemy fighters destroyed before they could close for lethal frontal attacks. Training reports from stations in England and Florida spoke of consistent gains in live fire effect and psychological stability in highly trained marksmen. The psychological part mattered most. Early in the war, gunners fired in panic, bursts short and frantic. Post-training evaluations from late 1944 described something entirely new: discipline under fire. Crews returned from raids clear-eyed, recounting their exchanges with precision. 3 lengths forward, one gunner told his debrief officer after a mission over Hanover. Held it steady. Saw the burst connect. For the first time since 1942, belief replaced doubt. Technology followed belief. Draper's Mark 14. Computing gunsight evolved rapidly into later versions like the Mark 15 and Mark 18, each lighter, faster, and more robust. Engineers at MIT's Radiation Laboratory integrated them into standard bomber production lines, while naval versions began appearing on Hellcats and Avengers at sea. The margin of error that once doomed entire formations was shrinking to fractions of a degree. Meanwhile, the Navy's success with Fleming and O'Hare's spot shooting method spread across its entire Pacific Fleet. Gunnery officers aboard the Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill incorporated deck drills into normal routines. Pacific Fleet Command measured hit rates rising above 9% on average and recorded dramatic drops in aircraft losses to 0 attacks. It was the same truth expressed through different tools, the blending of human adaptation and mechanical aid. Reporters who visited carrier decks near the Marianas in late 1944 wrote about gunners who spoke in a new, almost coded language. "Plane and a half lead, 2 clicks," one crewman said casually before takeoff, a phrase unthinkable 2 years earlier. The men had absorbed the deflection principle until it became as natural as breathing. Behind every success, though stood row upon row of names carved into metal memorials, those who never lived long enough to master the art. Historian Richard Hallion would later write that every corrected sight picture in 1944 was painted over the ghosts of 1943. The learning curve of war was paid for in lives, each one a reminder of how slow armies are to recognize the cost of ignorance. But now, unlike the frozen blood and smoke of 1943, there was measurable hope. Crews came home. Planes landed on 3 engines instead of none. Commanders could finally send their men into combat with the confidence that their guns worked not just mechanically, but mathematically. By late 1944, the air over Europe was changing physically too. Germany's Luftwaffe, once the predator, had become the prey. The fortified bomber streams that once shattered under attack now tore paths straight through enemy lines, unbroken. And still, from Europe to the Pacific, the human meaning of this mathematical victory was only beginning to unfold. In the months that followed, the transformation spread beyond the battlefield and into doctrine, the quiet rewriting of air combat's philosophy. At stateside gunnery schools, new recruits learned from manuals that no longer spoke of aiming at the target, but of tracking predictive motion. Diagrams showed enemy silhouettes with transparent arcs leading ahead of their noses, labeled probable point of intercept. The language of ballistics had merged with psychology. By 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces could field an entire generation of airmen fluent in those principles, men who trusted instruments and training as extensions of instinct. They called it precision discipline, the ability to separate fear from function. Every mission that returned testified that knowledge could be armor when metal wasn't enough. In March of that year, a report from the 8th Air Force's Gunnery Command summarized the war's evolution in the simplest terms. Hit expectancy increased 5.1x since early 1943. Confidence of personnel improved in proportion. That confidence reshaped bombing strategy itself. With formations able to defend themselves effectively, daylight bombing, once suicidal, became standard again. England's airfields filled with aircraft that would now reach Berlin and return alive. Across the Pacific, the new doctrine continued to save lives. During the battles for Leyte Gulf and the Philippines, carrier-based gunners shot down waves of Japanese aircraft with unprecedented precision. The trick that once seemed absurd, firing at empty air, was now second nature. U.S. Navy kill-to-loss ratios skyrocketed, and Japanese attack strategies that had terrified crews a year earlier began to falter against this new rhythm of defense. After victory in Europe and the eventual surrender of Japan, Allied analysts reviewed the statistics that had defined their survival. Buried within the massive reports on production, intelligence, and tactics was a quiet number, perhaps the most human one of all. During the war's final year, an average of 7 out of 10 bombers completed their missions and came home. In 1943, barely 4 had. Behind that difference stood the story of intuition defeated by mathematics, and of men humble enough to relearn how to see. But the end of the war did not end the lesson. The Mark 14's gyroscopic core evolved into early digital fire control systems in Korea, then radar-assisted gun sights in Vietnam. By the time jet warfare emerged, computers were performing in microseconds what Draper's analog gears had once done mechanically. The principle, predict motion and aim at the future, remained unchanged. Even modern missile systems carried the same ghost equations. Surface-to-air batteries, naval phalanx cannons, and intercept missiles all performed. The task Eddie Kowalski and Frank Donovan once struggled with, the impossible. Calculation of where to shoot when seconds meant miles. For veterans who had watched tracers vanish helplessly into blue nothing, the new technology felt like vindication. They had fought the first battle not with opponents, but with their own instincts, and won. The deflection revolution that began in desperation over Europe became one of the most important psychological rewrites in military history. It changed not only how gunners aimed, but how humans thought about combat itself. The acceptance that you could be brave and wrong at the same time, and that survival sometimes meant trusting the math over your fear. They say war is the ultimate teacher, but it rarely teaches gently. The story of America's gunners was proof of that. It began with courage and ended with correction, with thousands of young men realizing that doing what felt right could still get them killed. In learning to aim behind what they saw, they weren't just mastering a skill. They were rewiring the very reflex that defines human nature. We are hardwired to react to sight, to fight what is visible, to fear what is coming toward us. Yet war demanded something colder, smarter, more detached. The gunners who survived learned that survival itself could depend on ignoring instinct, on embracing the invisible logic of motion. The principle outlived them. Every modern weapon that tracks, predicts, and corrects is built on the same equation they died perfecting. Every automated system that intercepts a missile or locks onto a moving aircraft owes its lineage to those weary men staring through plexiglass, trying to trust a sight that pointed into empty air. In the decades that followed, historians would call their discovery one of the quiet revolutions of warfare. The moment humanity learned that knowledge could be courage, and that courage without understanding was simply waste. Somewhere in a museum, a Mark 14 gunsight still glows faintly under glass, its reticle frozen in light. Visitors pass by without knowing that this small device, half forgotten in metal and glass, once turned the tide of a war, not by adding firepower, but by teaching us to see the future before it arrived. Because in the end, the greatest victory of those gunners was not the planes they downed, but the lesson they left behind, that physics, not fear, decides the fight, and those who learn to aim for where the world will be will always outlive those who only shoot at where it is.